Back to my channel. So I'd like to carry on reviewing the Christine McGuinness documentary from where I left off. Thank you for your comments. I might see if I can try and do a comments video at some point. So I left off from when I was talking about the high number of autistic women with eating disorders, and I was talking about Christine herself only really eats beige food and dry food, and I was saying how different that is to my experience, because I am the complete opposite. I really, really love food, and cooking is my life, and food is my life in a healthy way, and I love eating food and all the different flavours and combinations. I sensory seek with food, and I know one of you put in the comments that you who are also autistic, one of you said in the comments that you yourself also really like food as well, so it shows I'm not the only autistic person who has a varied diet and likes to sensory seek around food. It's just that often there is a sort of, I guess there is a high number of autistics who do struggle with food, but clearly that's not every autistic experience. It would be quite nice, and I know they can't cover every single autistic person's experience in these documentaries, but it would be quite nice if maybe at some point they did show autistics who really enjoy food as well, because that could easily become a stereotype, couldn't it? If, people start to assume that all autistics have very limited diets, and of course it is a case for many autistics, and that needs to be highlighted and it needs to be talked about, particularly as one of you said, the kind of wider social ramifications of that definitely needs to be talked about, because it can really affect social interaction as well if you struggle with eating and other things like that. But it would be good to kind of maybe they could do, that would take a whole documentary in itself. Maybe they could kind of like look at the different relationships autistics have with food, from those who have a very limited diet, white food, to those who are like really interested in food like me and have a very varied diet and really sensory seek. Maybe that could be a whole documentary in and of itself, couldn't it? Anyway, then the documentary looked at how at secondary school autistic issues can become more evident, and that could potentially be one of the reasons why autistic girls are missed at primary school. This idea that at secondary school the problems start to become more manifest. For me, I wouldn't say that was the case. It's just my problems kind of morphed and changed over time. Like, my problems were really evident at primary school. If anything, I was even more outwardly impaired at primary school, because I wasn't even attempting to fit in when I was at primary school, and all the teachers noticed my social interaction problems and talked about it and mentioned it to my parents. And my parents were often called in because I was disrupting other kids, because I was reading aloud when I should have been reading quietly, because I was walking around a classroom and not focusing on what I was supposed to be focusing on, that I wasn't interacting with my peers. All of those things were a big talking point when I was at primary school. And I think actually, if anything, at primary school my problems were more evident, and teachers were more aware of them than at secondary school, precisely because, as it mentioned in a documentary, at primary school you just have one teacher, obviously gets to know you really well, you're in one class, and so if there's a child who's got like obvious issues, a teacher's going to be around that child like every day. It's going to be hard, I think, for them not to notice. And they noticed with me. But then when you go to secondary school, you have many different teachers, many different classes. Teachers don't have the time to get to know each individual pupil as well as, say, maybe a teacher does at primary school. So, they're not going to see this whole picture as much. And actually, when I got to secondary school, I kind of became invisible. Like, my problems became invisible in a sense, whereas at primary school all the teachers were really aware of them. I think just because I was in their class every day, they got to know me really well and they saw my problems. So yeah, it talks about how at secondary school the issues can become more apparent or more evident. Certainly when I was at secondary school, my issues were very evident and they kind of changed. Like, I tried to fit in more when I was at secondary school. It wasn't until sort of my mid to late teens that I really started to fit in, or even really became aware that I was different. But I did try to kind of inhibit my behaviours, my more out there behaviours a bit more, at least at the beginning of secondary school. It didn't work, so then I just reverted back to type really and just became very weird again, at least around the other kids. who were very aware I was different and I didn't have any friends. But I think the teachers would have probably not been aware, because at secondary school, even though I had an educational psychology report from primary school which follows me through to secondary school, but I don't think most teachers don't read very, they should, but seriously, I don't think most teachers when I was at secondary school really got to know me that well. I think they probably just saw a quiet kind of retiring girl just sitting on herself all the time. They don't get to know you as well at secondary school. So it's actually at primary school my problems are more apparent. So I, in a sense, had the opposite to that, what they talked about, but they were saying how some autistics, and I don't think this is just for autistic girls though, and obviously it does depend on who you are. I mean, it can't be across the board, it's got to vary between different people, but they said that for some autistics the problems aren't so evident at primary school, and then they become more evident at secondary school. But then of course whether or not the teachers are aware of that is a different thing entirely. So in my case, my problems were really, really evident at primary school. The teachers were aware of them. When I went to secondary school, teachers weren't so aware because I wasn't with them all the time. My mental health problems became a lot worse when I was at secondary school, and if anything, I became more disabled once I began secondary school, and more. I felt myself to be more increasingly impaired because I became more aware of my difficulties. But yeah, I think in a sense I became more invisible to the system once I started secondary school. Whereas at primary school all the teachers were very aware I had special needs essentially. I got some help when I started secondary school, and I had to go to learning support in the first year and a half. But then because I was meeting their targets, basically my parents were doing all the stuff for me, so scaffolding it wasn't exactly like I was actually making progress. It was just that my parents were doing it all behind the scenes. So meeting their targets, I then could just go back to having learning support in a classroom, and even that was eventually petered out, and then it's like I became completely invisible, even though my problems actually were getting worse. Which, so anyway, so they talk about, primary school is structured, one teacher, one class, there's set games. And then secondary is all about chatting, play is all about chatting, which can be very destabilising for autistic people. And like I say, many do develop mental health problems around that time, as indeed I did. My OCD really took off around... I've had OCD since I was actually quite a young child. It's always been to some extent. Although when I was a child, I didn't really see it as that. I didn't really experience it as a problem. And it was more transient, and it hadn't yet taken over my whole life. But once I started secondary school, those anxieties and mental health problems really kind of became quite extreme, and I started to experience it more as an impairment myself. So it's almost like when I began secondary school, I became more invisible to the system, and yet I started to experience my problems as more hindering and started to affect me more, whereas when I was at primary school, I was very obvious to the system, but I didn't actually experience myself as different or as impaired, and I was actually a lot more happier and content as a child, which is quite interesting. So I caused more problems for other people, who other people were more aware of it. And then when I started secondary school, I became more invisible. By the way, I was still causing a lot of problems at home with my family, by the way, that was another thing. It's just at school, became more invisible at secondary school. So Christine says how she dropped out of school age 14, she's got no qualifications, and she was seen as just being very naughty at school. And then she talked about how her mum encouraged her to enter beauty pageants, so she won Miss Junior Merseyside aged 13, she won Miss Commonwealth for England and Miss Liverpool aged 17. And she talks about the so-called power of pretending, how she could turn up on stage in a ball gown, sparkly shoes, etc., and basically sort of take on a role, which led her into modelling, where she has a clear role to play. And she says that kind of suits her really well, having this kind of role. It almost reminds me a little bit of my grandmother, who definitely was not exactly one-of-the-mill normal, she had problems. And when she was alive, she actually thought she might be autistic. When I got diagnosed, my grandmother suggested she might be herself. She definitely had issues. She was an eccentric one. And she went on and on about masking and trying to act and everything. This was before masking was actually talked about as a thing. She just used the term masking herself. She never really felt like she fitted in anywhere, and she was always acting, and she loved role play and stuff and dressing up. And she was really big on dressing up and wearing loads of makeup and constantly acting a role and a part and everything. A sort of role that she thought she needed to act. I don't know whether she was autistic. We can't say because she's dead now, and so we just have no way of knowing. and if she was, it was obviously extremely, high functioning. I mean, completely different to me, so we don't know. But my mum kind of didn't think she was, because she had a capacity to lie, essentially, and also she could be quite manipulative, and my mum was of the opinion she had a personality disorder. That's another thing, by the way. The distinction between personality disorders and autism is a growing field, and there can be a lot of overlap between the two, and it can be hard at times to know the distinction. I just thought I'd throw that as an aside. But yeah, like I say, this whole masking thing is problematic anyway, and as one of you said, for those who are more impaired and more disabled, it's not, you can't mask, it's impossible. Or if you can mask, you can only do it in a really kind of shallow way. Like, I can do it in a very shallow way, shallow compensation they call it. I certainly can't do what Christine does, but anyway. Moving over to video number 2 now.